Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel and who has the reputation of being a very principled libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, for those of you that are new to FFF, getting involved in our organization or in libertarianism, come and visit us at fff.org for some 28 years of commentaries, perspectives, and the like. Richard, I thought we'd go back and revisit this regime change operation that President Trump and his national security henchmen are engaged in down in Venezuela. You've got the U.S. military taking what they call humanitarian aid, which is a joke. This is tax-funded political aid. It has absolutely nothing to do with helping the Venezuelan people. That's, of course, manifested by Trump's wall, which he wants to use to keep out Venezuelans and other Latin Americans. This is all politics. This is a standard Cold War era national security statism regime change operations, and headed by old Cold War dead enders like Elliot Abrams and Michael Pompeo and John Bolton. These are all the Cold War dead enders, and Trump's obviously grown weary of the forever wars in the Middle East, but once an interventionist, always an interventionist. He's now over there threatening military action, if you can imagine that, against Venezuela. Now, of course, none of this is to defend or support the socialist regime there in Venezuela. It goes back to the original concept of America's foreign policy, a non-interventionist foreign policy in which the U.S. government does not go abroad, as John Quincy Adams said, in search of monsters to destroy. But I wanted to bring up an aspect of this that I really hadn't considered until I read an article about it, and the article was on Fox News, about the gun control aspects of this thing, which is really fascinating, and I think it has a very valuable lesson for Americans. It turns out that Nicolas Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela, that his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who was also a socialist, enacted a gun control law in Venezuela, strict gun control, requiring everybody to turn in their weapons. And they had these big deals where they were destroying the weapons and so forth. But they made it a felony offense with high penalties for anyone to own weapons in this country. And so obviously the law-abiding people, they end up with the weapons, and then only the government ends up with the weapons, along with the murderers and the rapists and the thieves and so forth, that they don't care whether they get caught with a illegal gun. As far as they're concerned, they're out to murder somebody or rob somebody, and this just assists them. So what happened is that the murder rate skyrocketed down there, and the violent crime rate skyrocketed, which is what we libertarians have been arguing for years, that all you're doing with gun control is disarming the victims of these crimes, murder, rape, and so forth. It deprives the person of the ability to defend themselves against the likes of people that are not going to pay attention to a gun control law if they're not going to pay attention to a murder law. It's just simple logic. But here's the other twist to this. Ever since our inception here at FFF, we have pointed out that the real basic idea behind the Second Amendment is the right to resist tyranny. And, there have been people on the left that have scoffed at this notion. Oh, gosh, that's antiquated. Sure, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had the potential of establishing a tyrannical regime, but not the likes of President Trump and Richard Nixon and Barack Obama and so forth. Well, here we have this socialist dictator in Venezuela that loves the people. He's got this socialist system, equalized wealth. He's trying to help the poor people and so forth. And now everybody's starving to death, and you can tell there's a mass opposition to what he's doing, even to the extent that people are practically begging the U.S. government to come and help them. Why? Because they've given up the ability to overthrow the government. Now, that's not to suggest that they would have pursued that. You know, a violent revolution is very costly. But the fact is they eliminated that option with that gun control law. Now the option is you obey or you get shot at a protest or something, because you've got soldiers out there. Venezuela is a national security state, just like the U.S. is, that are ready to follow orders and put down these demonstrations and protests. But the fact is that when people surrender their arms, they lose that ability to resist tyranny. And you see the left, praising people in Europe, for disarmament and gun control laws and so forth, ignoring the possibility that if any of those European countries ever ends up with a tyrannical regime again, there's only one choice that people have, and that is obey or die. And that's what we're seeing in Venezuela. That's what the Venezuelan people are faced with. You either submit to the tyranny of this regime, and it clearly is tyranny, or you die in a protest, or you beg some federal daddy from the United States to come in and assist you. Pretty bad state of affairs, Richard, but a valuable lesson for the American people to never surrender their guns under any conditions.
Well, just to amplify some of your points, why is it that traditionally Americans have taken such a strong view about a right to bear arms? And there is two reasons for this. There are threats to our life and property, to ourselves and our family members, from both private individuals and from government individuals. Certainly an individual has a right to defend their life and that of their family loved ones. Not even the staunchest anti-gun control person would say that if a person is broken into your house and is threatening you with a knife or attempting to strangle you, that you don't have a right to resist, unless they believe that people should not have a right to in any way protect themselves. Now, once you say a person has a right to resist a violent aggressor, then you're saying that they have a right to use defensive and reactive force against them. You punch them. You grab a lamp and throw it at them. There's a knife handy, and you may have to attack them with a knife, fearing for your own life, or some deep physical harm or violation of you or a family member. Now, if you accept that view, then the issue is what weapon is permitted and which is not. The fact is, firearms have been around for centuries now, and they have been used by private individuals to coerce against their neighbor. Acts of just out-and-out murder, acts of thievery, and in the process of undertaking the theft, finding himself, the thief, confronted by the owner or the homeowner or some other individual, and having to, because of being identified or fearful of being resisted in his act of robbery, using physical violence and threat against the innocent individual. And if you don't have a right to defend yourself in some counteracting way equal to what the aggressor is doing, then you're basically saying a person doesn't have a right to their own life and to defend it. This is most true in spite of the political incorrectness. And I stand charged of a man of the 20th century. There's a difference between women and men. Hello? I know it's shocking. And I read this somewhere in a book, that men are different from women. Now, one feature is that in general and on average, men tend to be physically stronger than women. That doesn't mean that there's some women who could beat the crap out of some guy, but in general, men are physically stronger than women. And that means that if a man attacks a woman to rob her, to beat her up for some reason, or to sexually violate her, What recourse is she to have to resist this? Oh, she should scream. Oh, she should try to run away. Well, what if you're cornered? What if it's clear what this individual has in mind? To both rape you and then perhaps kill you. There's a great equalizer for a woman who is in that position. It's known as a revolver, some type of hand pistol in her pocket or her purse. That suddenly makes the battle and the fight far more on an even playing field. However shocking it is, there have been women who have been raped. There have been women who have been murdered, either resisting rape or after the rape, who in principle might have saved themselves if they had had access to and use of a firearm to resist her assailant. People talk about, women's rights, a woman's right to live her own life, to be respected and not violated either physically or verbally. Well, the fact is, we live in a nasty world in which bad things are done. And given the fact that biologically, in the statistical sense, women are generally physically weaker than a man, this is a means to defend herself. And all of these attempts, no, we're going to require stringent registration rules, or we're going to deny the right to carry a firearm, concealed or unconcealed, or you have to put it in a lockbox with 27 locks attached to it that you have to go through to open the lockbox. This is absolutely nonsense. It is a right to protect yourself. Now, the fact is that governments, if you accept the tradition in the spirit of America, governments are secured among men to protect their liberty and not violate their liberty. But there is an old question since the time of the ancient Romans: who guards us from the guardians? They are the people who specialize in the use of firearms. They are the ones who have that as their niche in the division of labor. And if they've not brutally established their own military dictatorship, they serve at the behest of those who have political authority and legitimacy and are trained to, quote, obey orders. Now, the fact is there have been and there are governments that are violators of people's rights, tyrannies, dictatorships, totalitarian regimes that have done terrible things to not just Joe and Sam and Sally and Betty, but to tens of millions of innocent men, women, and children. Firearms are a last resort. I emphasize a last resort, because civil wars and revolutions are wild things that can have terrible unintended consequences. But there does occur times in the course of human events when individuals must protect themselves from their own government as well as the private thief or bandit. We see this today in Venezuela. Their government is willing to brutalize the people to maintain a tyrant in control. Let's think about Syria, right? People in America will say, oh, gun ownership is bad. Yet what has the U.S. government done? And this goes to both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. What has the United States government done? It has distributed and supplied arms to many groups in Syria. To do what? To oppose the Assad regime, the legitimate government that has its representative sitting at the United States as an internationally recognized regime. Has it been wrong? Now, I'm not defending U.S. selling of armaments. I'm talking about the principle that the idea of providing people with weapons to defend themselves or resist the aggression of their own government. Why aren't the anti-gun people saying, how dare either private individuals or the government give arms to the Syrian people to resist the legitimate government? Because after all, the policeman is your friend, including the Assad police. Or the situation with Maduro in Venezuela. The fact is that the right to bear arms in the American tradition is there to protect yourself from private aggression and as a last resort to secure your liberty against the very government that's supposed to protect your freedom becomes as the aggressor to deny it.
Yeah, you're right about guns being the great equalizer when it comes to private acts of violence. And your example of a woman who is possibly going to be raped is a perfect example. Is that many women lack that physical strength against their aggressor, and the gun's a great equalizer. That now makes her have the ability to defend against this rape. And if they disarm Americans, they make it illegal to own guns, the probability is that most women, most ordinary citizens, most guys are going to comply with the law because it's so dangerous to get caught. Like, in Washington, D.C., you get caught with a weapon, you're looking at possibly 20 years in jail, or New York City. So most people comply with the law. So you're effectively saying, as you put it, you have to submit. You have no real choice. That your right to resist becomes a nullity if you don't have the ability to resist. And the gun provides that ability. There's also another factor of this, and that's the threat of foreign invasion. Now, obviously, there is no threat that the United States is under at the present time from any nation state in the world from an invasion. No nation state has the military means, the money, the interest, the troops, the supply lines to cross the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean. Nonetheless, that if there were ever a nation state to contemplate it, they would think twice about invading a country where all the citizenry are armed, or a large percentage of the citizenry are armed. And the perfect example of this is Switzerland, a country that minds its own business, doesn't get involved in all these regime change operations, doesn't meddle in foreign affairs. It just limits itself to defense. And no one would dare to invade Switzerland because it knows everybody's armed to the teeth, and it would be like swallowing a porcupine. And then finally, Richard, it's this idea of resistance to tyranny. Now, the question obviously arises, is the U.S. government capable of becoming a tyrannical regime? And the left, the gun control crowd, says, oh, no, that's an antiquated notion. That could never happen in the United States. And yet, we live under a type of governmental system, and have since World War II, called a national security state, that wields many of the same totalitarian-like powers that tyrannical regimes wield. It wields the power to assassinate us, and it has exercised that power against American citizens, and fully enforced by the Supreme Court, supported, confirmed by the Supreme Court, which has always been deferential to the national security establishment. It has the power to take Americans into custody, place them into military dungeons, torture them, and power that has been exercised, again supported, confirmed by the federal courts. It has the power to round people up like it did Japanese Americans, put them into concentration camps, again fully supported by the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. We also see that this government, the U.S. government, led by the national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, that supports tyrannical regimes, installs them into power, partners with them. Egypt is a good example. That's a military dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship. And as you point out, this is one of the countries where they furnish them weaponry so they can fortify their tyrannical hold on their own citizens. I mean, that's your classic military dictatorship in Egypt. The U.S. national security establishment loves them. Same with Saudi Arabia. Brutal authoritarian dictatorship. The U.S. partners with it, assists it with its war in Yemen, excuses its murderous campaigns, does everything it can to curry favor with them because they're an oil-producing nation. Another example historically was the installation of the brutal regime in Chile, the regime of Augusto Pinochet, which rounded up some 60,000 innocent people, raped, tortured, or killed many of them, including executing about 3,000 of them. All without due process of law. Classic tyrannical regime, and the U.S. loved them. The CIA loved them. The Pentagon loved them. They were killing supposed communists or people who believed in communism. That was their only crime. So it's not a big leap to have a government that supports tyranny and overseas countries on the basis of, quote, national security, and importing that concept here if an emergency arises. And of course, the term emergency is all nebulous, and lies in the eyes of the beholder. But if we live under a president that can declare an emergency with immigration, you can declare an emergency on anything. And then with this emergency, then you see arising these powers of torture, indefinite detention, roundups, assassination, that are all the hallmarks of a tyrannical regime. Now, when do people finally draw the line and say, you're not going to do this to us, you're not going to Abu Ghraib my daughter or my wife or whatever? Where do people draw the line? Well, that's a difficult issue, and Thomas Jefferson points this out in the Declaration. He says people do have a right to overthrow their government, just as the Venezuelan people do. But it's something people will put up with a lot of tyranny before they finally say enough's enough, we're going to revolt, because of the high price and death and suffering that inevitably takes place in a revolution. That's another reason why the U.S. government has no business in Venezuela trying to incite people like it did in Syria. Go ahead and revolt, we'll support you, and all this. I mean, look how many people have been killed in Syria now. That this is a decision that always should be left to the citizenry of another country without inciting and promising to support and so forth. But ultimately, if people make that decision, they have to have the ability to overthrow that government. They have to have the ability to draw the line and say, no, you're not going to cross this line, and if you do, I'm going to oppose you with force. You may take me down, but I'm going to take as many people as I can with me. Because that in itself, when people are armed, serves as a deterrent to the potential tyrant that might otherwise say, oh, with all these disarmed people, I'll do whatever I want. But with all these armed people, I better think twice before I take those steps.
Yes, a little bit of armament goes a long way. The classic instance of this was in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. The German army, under obviously Nazi direction, the political direction, decided that they were going to clear out the Warsaw Ghetto of the remaining Jews who had been stuck in there by the Nazis, and to be sent off to the concentration camps and the death camps. And they were able to clandestinely get from the wider Polish underground a small handful of armaments. They made some Molotov cocktails and so on. And the German army, they just sweep these Jews away in a day, attempting to resist. Well, that small band of partly armed members of the Jewish community there decided to resist to the full measure. And for almost 60 days, they held back the attempt of the Nazis to clear out the ghetto. And they took a lot of German soldiers with them before they died or the remnant surrendered, and of course then was sent off to those camps to face an ultimate other type of fate. Just think, if in every country that the Germans had occupied during the Second World War, the citizens of those countries had been armed the way the Swiss armed their citizens, as a civilian army, and that no German military unit or Gestapo unit could go into any French village or Dutch community or Norwegian town or Polish village or without not knowing for sure if they were going to be facing not just individuals but clusters of individuals who were willing to undertake the risk of resisting both their occupation and their attempt to violate those citizens' rights in their attempt to conquer a continent. I would suggest that it would have been much more costly, much more difficult, and much more demoralizing for the average German soldier. In World War II, what was the biggest threat that you could say to a German soldier if he didn't obey orders? We will send you to the Eastern Front. Well, you didn't want to face the Russians, the weather, and they were brutal. But hey, we're better to sit out the war than being in occupied France or Holland or Belgium or Norway or any of these other countries. Why? Because, yeah, there was underground organizations that they undertook, sabotage and attacks on German units. but they were few and far between if you look at the stream of all of the events of the war. But if every European had been armed and the Germans could know who had these armaments, where, when, and how many, it wouldn't have been such a pleasant duty to be stationed in occupied France instead of fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, Switzerland, Hitler wanted to invade Switzerland. I mean, it would have been a great thing for him because they had combined with Italy, and by taking over Switzerland, that could have provided him easy access to coordinate the war efforts with Italy. But his advisor said, look, we will win. There's no question we will win, but we will be so devastated after invading Switzerland that it will not be worth it, because they have all their places ready to go to blow up bridges and tunnels, and everybody is armed to the teeth. They have assault weapons in their homes. Everybody knows where to go in the event of an emergency, and they're fierce fighters, the Swiss. And so at the end of this, Hitler said, it's just not worth it. We're going to lose so many troops in this battle that we're not going to do it. And I'm reminded of the movie Braveheart, where there's that scene where the guy gets married, and then the Lord shows up with the troops and everything, and he says, I'm here to claim my right of prima noctur, where he gets to sleep and have sex with the new bride. And of course all his little band of soldiers are there, and the husband is outraged and he's going to resist, and his wife tells him, stop it, because there was no way he could stand up against this armed bunch of people. But then, Braveheart comes into this. His wife gets killed, and that was the line. All right, you've crossed my line. I'm coming after you. And then people had that right of resistance to resist tyranny. But always, what it's in the interest of governments to do is to disarm the citizenry. This is why Chavez disarmed people, because he knew what was coming, that his socialist system was going to bring tighter and tighter controls. I mean, this is why the British government decided to confiscate weapons at Concord and Lexington of the British colonists. We often think that the people there in the American Revolution were great Americans. They were not great Americans that signed the Declaration of Independence. They were great Englishmen. They were as English as you and I are Americans. They were taking up arms against their own government. They were shooting their own government's troops. And one of the first things that the English government did was, let's go confiscate the weapons. And that's what triggered the revolution, because the colonists knew what was going on. That you take our weapons, all of a sudden we got to submit to your tyranny over here. With our weapons, we have the ability to overthrow or to revolt. Not overthrow, but to revolt against your regime and essentially secede from your regime. So that's a thing to keep in mind. There was a great judicial opinion in the case of Lockyer versus Silvera, where Judge Kaczynski wrote, it's either a concurring decision or a dissenting decision, I can't remember, but where he made a great point. He says, when people surrender their guns, they can only make the mistake once, because once they make that mistake and they surrender their guns and they end up with a tyrannical regime, one that doesn't stand for elections, that uses the military to extend its power, then all of a sudden, what recourse do people have at this point? They can't say, oh, can we have our guns back? Because the regime's not going to give them their guns back. And that's why Kaczynski says, this is a mistake that can only be made once. It will never be made twice, because the regime that's in power will not permit them to have the guns again to make it twice.
Right. Well, I think that the important lesson of what we've been talking about today, Jacob, is for hopefully the viewers and listeners to appreciate that, when those on the left say, oh, the gun nuts, the rifle crazy people, the people who want to facilitate violence in the society, it's more reflective and reasoned and historical than that. The case for the right to bear arms is nothing more and nothing less than the right of a form of self-defense in which others may have serious and dangerous lethal weaponry. And the ultimate protection has to be against one's own government. I really want to hammer away here. I'm not defending rebellion. I'm not calling for the overthrow of any government. I'm not saying that situations have ever reached or would necessarily reach the United States where it'd be necessary for such armed resistance. But the fact is, history is on the side of those who have said that better to be precautionary than not. You know, a lot of people can say it can't happen here. Well, they thought that about Italy, in Italy before Mussolini. They thought that way about in Germany before Hitler. I can assure you that many Russians who were pushing for what would be called, in the broader sense, liberal reforms in Russia before the First World War broke out, under their autocratic monarchy, would have said that, yes, the Tsar is brutal, he calls out his troops occasionally, we're sick and tired of it, but the idea of, you know, a government so even worse than the Tsar, it can't happen here. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
And unless the people have means of self-protection against both private aggression and potential government threats that could exist, then the people are faced with both private and government tyranny.
Yeah, I look at the right to own guns as an insurance policy. It's like when you buy fire insurance on your home. Well, you go through your entire lifetime and your house never starts on fire, but very few people think they've wasted their money. I mean, this is something that's important to them just in case. That's the right to own guns, is that it's an insurance policy. It not only deters government from going down this road, but it provides the people the means to resist if the unspeakable were ever to happen.
Absolutely.
So on that note, Richard, we're out of time. We'll wrap it up. Greatly enjoyed the conversation with you, as I do every week, and I want to thank our viewers for tuning in, for your comments, both favorable and critical, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and let me just join Jacob in thanking all of you for sharing a little bit of your time with us.